Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to be looking at how to paint a seashell. Primarily we'll be concentrating on the wet on wet aspects of this subject. You'll be able to use the techniques you learned from this video in many other subjects that have similar textures. Let's begin with the drawing. I'm going to start by wetting the back of the paper. This will give me a lot more time to paint the wet on wet sections of this painting. I'm using 185 GSM Arches cold press paper, and it's an 1/8 sheet. Put it a couple of times. I'll let it sit there and let the water settle in. And while it's doing that, I'll mix my colours. It's a small painting, so I don't need to mix a lot. I'm going to have a warm brown, cooler brown, and just a hint of a much darker tone. So I'll start with a little bit of raw sienna, test it on a piece of paper. This is going to be my next to lightest tone. I will leave some of the paper untouched. That's good. And then a stronger mix for the darker tones. I'll add a little bit of raw umber to that too. Don't want it too yellow. I'm not too concerned about getting the colour right. I'm primarily focusing on the tones. And here, an even stronger tone, raw umber and raw sienna. Touch of burnt sienna as well. That's good. We'll leave that brush there. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to this too. It's a bit too much, so we'll go back in with the raw sienna. That's better. Maybe just a bit more. Great. And primarily these will be our colours. Later I'll mix some colours for the shadows. Let's go back to our paper. I pick up quite a lot of water with my big 24 brush. It's amazing how much moisture this paper will absorb. And we'll lift that and I'll wet the board, being careful not to drop any more water in my palette, otherwise I'll dilute those tones. I'm going to begin by doing a weak wash of the raw sienna. And that'll go over the whole seashell apart from some areas where I want some white paper showing through. So that's the lightest tone, other than the white paper. Now I'm going to go in with this darker tone, and I'm just using a size 8 brush. I used a size 12 for the bigger shapes. Now I'm going to use a smaller brush. Now I didn't pre-wet the paper because I wanted some of this white paper preserved. But as soon as you start painting on the surface of your paper, you're leaving behind wet areas. They're wet with the paint. And so if you paint into those wet areas, what you'll do is create these wet on wet soft edges. And this is where the practice comes in. If you have too much paint on your brush, it will just flood the damp or wet area, and you'll lose, the highlights. I'm going to mix a warmer colour here. It's not necessarily the colour that's in the reference, but sometimes I like to add a bit of warmth, and that helps bring a section forward. using the tip of the brush here where it hits the wet paint. It then gives me these lovely soft edges. But again, I have to stress that you have to always be aware of how much paint is in your brush. If you don't want the paint to flow too far, then don't have a lot of paint in your brush. You'll quite often see me drag the brush to the edge of my palette, or tapping the brush on a tissue if I want to take out even more paint, or not a tissue, a towel. Keep your spray bottle handy, because as soon as the surface here starts losing its shine, I'll need to spray it. Right now it's pretty good, but quite soon you'll see me use the spray bottle to allow me to continue to paint with these wet on wet shapes. It's important that you treat this as a learning exercise and that you learn from every brush stroke. Where I paint over dry paper, I'll get a harder edge or a hard edge. When we refer to it as a hard edge, we're talking about a more defined edge. Just get a bit of cobalt blue to cool and dull some of this colour. Now my board is at about 20 degrees. If you find that the paint's running down the paper too fast, then lower the angle of the board. You could also paint this almost horizontal. Now I'm going in with a clean brush that I've taken probably about 70% of the water out and softening some of these edges. And you don't want to do this with too much water in your brush, or all the paint will just merge together. You can also use the damp brush to lift some paint. Now I'm mixing a very thick mix of these three colours. Very little water in that mixture. Even when I put a mark into a wet area, paint generally stays at that spot. This is a great exercise to help you develop your awareness of just how wet your brush is, how wet the paper is. All right, so right there I can see this is drying quite quickly, so get my spray bottle. Usually give it a quick spray away from my painting to make sure that the nozzle doesn't get stuck and I end up with a big blob of water right on my painting. Then I hold the spray bottle almost right on top of the painting surface, but perpendicular to it. And then I give it a good spray. What happens when you do that, most of the water actually lands off the paper and only the lightest droplets will land on the painting. And what happens, I won't get into too much of a physics exercise, but the water droplets are attracted to the wet parts of the painting. But see how they leave the dry parts relatively untouched. You have to be a bit more careful because obviously in this area here where there's no wetness already, you will now find that that's a little bit damp. But around these areas, the dry sections will stay dry. Bring the brush, go in, just soften that edge. All right, so we'll let that dry and then we'll go in and finish it off with some shadows. For the shadow colour, I'm going to start with some French ultramarine. Small amount of permanent rose just to create a slightly violet colour. You want it to lean to the blue. In fact, I'll add a bit of cobalt blue to it just to cool that off. So I've got one brush. This is clean water. I'm not particularly overloaded with it. See how the brush is not bouncing back to a point. And I use the water brush, this brush here with just water in it, to soften the edges after I lay down some of the shadow colour. And I soften the edges by just touching the wet paint. So now we're painting wet on dry, which is why I need to soften the edges with clean water if I want to create a soft shape like that. Not too much paint on my brush. Just drop in some paint like that. If I want to keep a sharp edge, then I don't soften it. Another way to create a soft edge would be to wet an area first and then drop the paint in. And I'll mix a little bit of a very dull grey brown colour by mixing some of this blue with this colour here. Then before that dries, I'll go in and lighten and soften some of those marks. All right, I'm going to dry that now. Then a few sharp edges and the cast shadow onto the paper, and we should be finished. You find you have to re-wet the back of the paper from time to time if you want it to sit nice and flat like this. Now, if we look at the shadow that's cast, most of them are relatively soft-edged. So to help with that, I'm going to wet the paper around the shell. So I'll pick up my size 16 brush because I want to wet it fairly quickly. I don't want to wet the shell itself because there's a hard edge in between the shadow on the paper and the seashell. And you can sort of see now how the paper's got shine on it where I've wet it. Okay, so we've got this shadow color here. I'm going to use that and just drop that in. Keep the brush handy that I used to wet the paper because there'll be areas that I missed. Don't want too much paint on your brush or you'll end up with a big blob coming out. It's not the end of the world if you do that, you just have to lift some of the paint. And this will help add some depth to the shell. Now you'll see that the shadow close to the shell is actually quite dark. So what I have to do is add some more of those colours. And I'll add some burnt sienna too. Now I've lifted the board up so that it's almost horizontal because I don't want this paint to run down too much. Because this is a brown colour, some of that colour will reflect into the shadow. So I'm just going to pick up some of this mixture, not a lot of paint in my brush, and just drop some of that in. And then just a few sharp edges on the shell itself. I'm going to dry that and maybe just darken the shadow on the shell a little bit more. So when you use the hairdryer to dry your paper, always let it cool down first, otherwise the paint that you put on your paper will not flow and you risk muddying up sections of your painting. Now, I'm going to turn this around. Using quite a big brush because I want to put this mark on quite quickly. Like that. Clean the brush, take out 3/4 of the water and just run that along like that. And I think that will do it. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so and hit the notification bell so you'll be advised of each new video I produce. And if you could, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next video.